So the last measure of cost we're going to talk about, it's another long-run cost measure in thinking about whether to build a new power plant or not, and that's the annual revenue requirement. So the annual revenue requirement is how much money would we have to make each year on this power plant to make it worth building. So this shows for a given power plant, this is the annual average cost of a unit of power generation capacity. So what we're going to do now is we're going to say for each unit of capacity of this power plant, for each megawatt of capacity we're building, how much money does that megawatt of capacity have to bring in each year to make it worth putting that unit of capacity in place? So I've got a 500 megawatt hour plant, a 500 megawatt capacity plant I'm thinking about building. What I want to know is for each megawatt I'm going to put in place, how much money does it have to make each year in order to make it worth building? So it's the amount of revenue per unit of capacity that a power plant must earn if it's going to break even. Any more than that, it's worth building. Any less than that, it's not worth building. So the annual revenue requirement is the annual payment per megawatt of capacity plus the variable cost of operating the plant. Well, what's the payment per megawatt of capacity? Well, it's just the capital costs per megawatt. We take our capital costs, divide them by the total megawatt capacity of the power plant, and that gives us the annual payment per megawatt of capacity. But then we have to take into account the variable costs, because we have to earn at least the variable costs or we wouldn't run the plant. And the variable costs, of course, depend on the capacity factor. So let's run through a sample average revenue requirement calculation. First, we'll do the fixed cost part. We take our monthly payment, but since this is an annual revenue requirement, we're going to take the monthly payment and multiply it by 12 to get our annual payment. Then we divide by the capacity of the power plant. Well, what's our annual payment? That's our $1,129,000 monthly payment multiplied by 12. $2,129,000 per month multiplied by 12, which is $25,548,000. We divide that by the 500 megawatt capacity of the plant. This plant has to earn $51,000 a year for each of the 500 megawatts of capacity in order for it to be worth running. So its fixed earnings per unit of capacity that it has to make in order to make it worth running is $51,000. But we also have a variable cost part. For each unit of capacity, we're going to have a certain variable cost associated with that unit of capacity depending on how much we run the plant. So again, we have to go back and ask, well, what capacity factor are we likely to use for this power plant? Well, the design capacity factor for this power plant is 80%, but whatever that capacity factor is, we're going to calculate the variable cost part by taking the fuel cost per hour. So how much can we generate per hour? Well, that's 500 megawatt hours we can generate in an hour because it's a 500 megawatt plant. What does fuel cost? $2.50 per million BTU. Multiply that by the heat rate, and that gives us $11,250 per hour to buy the fuel to run the 500 megawatts. We multiply that by 8,760 hours in a year, then times the capacity factor. So we take our 8,000 hours per year, 8,760 hours per year, multiply that by the capacity factor to get how many hours do we think we'll actually be running it. So in my assumed case, that was 80%. So we take the 8,760 hours, multiply it by 80%, and that would give us the total number of hours we expect to operate the plant. So we take our $11,000 in fuel costs, multiply it by the number of hours we think we're going to run the plant, and that gives us our total fuel cost, our total variable cost for running the plant. Well, in this particular plant, if I run it at 100% capacity, I'm going to be paying $11,000 for all 8,760 hours. That would add up to $98,500,000 a year, multiplied by capacity factor. That gives us our actual variable cost, part of our annual our annual revenue calculation. So to finish up, I have our annual revenue requirement as a function of capacity factor here. So it's 51,000 for the fixed part, 98,500,000 for the fuel cost part. Now, one of the things I want to point out is that it's obvious that as the capacity factor rises, the fuel costs are going to dominate the fixed cost part of the cost of running this power plant. In terms of the annual revenue requirement, the fixed cost part is a very small part of the total cost for the plant. But let's take an example where we run the plant at a 10% capacity factor. Well, we have the $51,000 fixed cost part. We have, at 10% capacity factor, our fuel costs are $9,855,000. And so our total annual revenue requirement at 10% capacity factor is $9,906,000 for this power plant. So if we're going to run this power plant at 10% capacity factor, then we're going to need to make $9,906,000 a year in order to justify building the power plant. One of the really useful things about the annual revenue requirement as a measure of long-run costs for a power plant is that it allows you to compare the long-run costs of different kinds of power plants. And so as the capacity factor increases, you can decide, well, for a power plant with this capacity factor, with this expected capacity factor, it has a lower or higher annual revenue requirement than some other power plants. So you compare different power plants according to their annual revenue requirement, but based on what you think the likely capacity factor for that power plant is going to be. And so given what you're thinking about building, do I need a peaking plant or a base load plant? Then you look at the expected capacity factor and you can decide what kind of plant seems to make the most financial sense given the capacity factor you choose. So given the graph we have here on the slide, you can see that if we're comparing a gas turbine, I'm going to step back and choose a pencil here. We're comparing a gas turbine. There's my marker. Comparing a gas turbine with a baseload coal-fired power plant. And so at a very low capacity factor, in fact, if you think about no capacity factor at all, if you think about a zero capacity factor, then the annual revenue requirement is really just paying off the capital cost of the power plant. There's no fuel cost if you have zero capacity factor. And so zero capacity factor is really just the capital cost per megawatt hour of building the plant in the first place. So for a gas turbine, at a very low capacity factor, the cost is quite low. the capital cost is low, so the annual revenue requirement to cover the capital cost of the plant is also very low. At very low capacity factors, the annual revenue requirement is going to be lower for power plants with low capacity factors. And so let's take a capacity factor of, say, 15%, about half of the 30% marked here. So we have a capacity factor of 15%. At 15%, the annual revenue requirement for a coal plant is much higher than the annual revenue requirement for a gas turbine, mainly because the capital expenditures for the gas turbine are very small compared to the capital expenditures for a coal-fired power plant. Now, for a given unit of capacity factor, the fuel costs for the coal plant are going to be lower than the fuel cost for the gas turbine. As the capacity factor goes up, the coal plant is going to become the better deal because it has much lower fuel costs per megawatt hour. The marginal costs are much lower for the coal plant. And after, as you can see on the graph, after you get to 30% capacity, the 30% capacity factor is where the annual revenue requirements for the coal-fired power plant and the gas turbine are equal. Any capacity factor higher than 30%, the baseload coal-fired power plant is a better deal in terms of its long-run cost of operation than the gas turbine. And so you would build a coal-fired power plant if the duty cycle was going to be higher than 30%. But if the duty cycle is going to be lower than 30%, you would want to build a gas turbine. And the annual revenue requirement actually allows you to compare these different types of plants depending on what your needs are in terms of meeting an increment of electricity demand. If this is just going to be a peaking plant and have a very low capacity factor, its annual revenue requirements will be low. You would choose a gas turbine relative to, compared to a coal-fired power plant.